What are the social costs of inflation? The first thing a lot of people think about is that when prices go up, it increases the cost of living, and therefore paychecks are becoming weaker. However, this usually isn't the case. Why? Because wages go up too. This chart graphs both the CPI and nominal wages. The CPI is in blue, and the average hourly earnings of production and non-supervisory workers is in red. We do this so that we're not including managers or the wealthy. Both of these series are indexed so that 1970 equals 100. And we can see over the past 50 years that wages have kept up with prices. And for the past 8 years or so, wages have actually risen faster than prices. The red's slightly higher than the blue. However, this is a long-run story. In the short run, sometimes wages will lag behind prices. And in the time horizon of 6 to 12 months, the purchasing power of people's paychecks really do decline. In the recent inflationary period, who is harmed more? Those with higher incomes or those with lower incomes? The horizontal axis in these graphs represents the hourly earnings percentile. Lower incomes are on the left, and higher incomes are on the right. The vertical axis tells us the annualized percent change in nominal hourly earnings. In other words, wage growth. The blue dotted line tells us the inflation over the period, and the red line tells us the wage growth over the period. Whose wages grew the fastest? Those on the lower end of the income distribution. Each graph looks at different time periods. The one on the left is a 36-month change from fall 2019 to late summer 2022. The middle graph is a 24-month change, and the last graph is a 12-month change comparing wages and prices from late summer 21 to late summer 22, the most serious year of inflation. And what do we find? Over a 3-year horizon, the bottom half of the income distribution saw wage growth faster than the inflation rate. However, in that year from 21 to 22, only the bottom part of the income distribution kept up with inflation, and the higher income we see, the slower the income growth. So to review, a lot of people's wages did not keep up with inflation, especially in that very inflationary period. However, unlike a lot of other economic measures, the lower income distribution performed the best. Why? We came out of the pandemic with a very strong demand for labor. Everyone was worried about worker shortages. Businesses were having a lot of activity and wanted to hire a lot of people. They had to start competing for workers in a way that they hadn't had to compete in a long time. And when workers are scarce, businesses will start outbidding each other, raising the wages. And they rose enough to not only keep up with inflation in the short run, but to actually surpass it. At the time of this recording in fall 2023, wages for everybody are now growing much faster than inflation. In the long run, the purchasing power of our paychecks always keeps up with inflation, and for many surpasses it. So, outside of these short-run issues, what are the main costs of inflation? We can split this up into two categories: expected inflation and unexpected inflation. When inflation comes as expected, there are not many costs to society. Everybody can plan for it in the future. It's written into all of our contracts. And because of this, the Federal Reserve generally targets a 2% annual inflation. Everybody expects it to come, and we all planned accordingly. It is the unexpected inflation that causes problems. The first thing is going to confuse the signals that prices send. In order for a market to work, we need an accurate price to help supply and demand meet up and help us produce the most efficient quantity. It helps us choose how much to produce and who gets it. Unexpected inflation messes up that relationship. The second bit is that unexpected inflation will unexpectedly redistribute income. We can see this if we think about interest rates. The real interest rate is equal to the nominal interest rate, that's the interest rate we use in our contracts, minus the inflation rate. This is a formula worth memorizing. Who benefits more when inflation goes up? Interest rates will be used for loans, borrowers pay interest, and banks receive interest. And both of them care about the real interest rate. So if there's unexpected inflation, what happens to that real interest rate? Let's say a 30-year mortgage is written for an interest rate of 5%, and at the time of the signing, everybody expected a 2% inflation rate. The real interest rate comes out to 3%. The family purchasing the home is paying 3%, and the bank is receiving a real interest rate of 3%. However, what if the inflation rate bumped up? It's now 4%. Then the real interest rate is now 1%. Who likes lower interest rates? The buyers of the home. So on the one hand, people get a little excited, like, yeah, unexpected inflation. That's going to redistribute money from the banks to the people. Well, at first, but what happens when the inflation is unexpectedly declining afterwards? So people get locked into these long-term mortgages. Let's say you bought a house in 1980. At the time, the average mortgage rate was nearly 13%, and that coincided with a double-digit inflation rate in red, for a real interest rate of near zero. However, when the inflation plummeted in the early 80s, now borrowers were paying back at a much higher real interest rate. When inflation unexpectedly falls, the real interest rate rises, therefore distributing money from the borrowers to the banks. So regardless of however you feel about banks, using unexpected inflation to fix that, number one, won't work in the long run, and number two, disrupts the system for everybody. Here's the second cost of inflation: menu costs. When prices in the economy are changing quickly, firms have to frequently reprint menus. And one would think, okay, printing menus isn't that costly. Possibly, but having the economy full of very noisy price information means firm will be operating less optimal than before. It simply increases the uncertainty in the economy. And less efficient firms means less productivity for the whole economy, and a lower productive capacity can cause economic harm for households and families. And to show that, yes, even the printing menu costs are real, here are real pictures from the past few years, rewriting the menu prices with a Sharpie, or covering up old prices with literal duct tape. The next cost has to do with the fact that you don't want to hold on to cash when we're experiencing inflation. And so how do you get rid of your cash? You spend it. And if everybody is out spending more than normal, we have to wait in line more. We call this shoe leather costs. And we can see it not just in the literal leather of your shoes wearing out for waiting in line more, but we have to take the time to do more errands and make more frequent transactions. Again, it's a question of efficiency. You can't wait and make the purchase when it's most optimal for you. You now have to do it earlier, and so does everybody else, plugging up the whole system. So keep those things in mind. To review, the primary cost of inflation is not the fact that it harms our paychecks, because paychecks keep up in the long run. The primary long-run costs of inflation are the unexpected redistribution of income that bogs down the lending industry. Number two, it increased menu costs. And number three, increase the frequency of transactions beyond the optimal amount to create shoe leather costs. So what can one do to avoid the effects of inflation on wealth? I mean, the first one is you don't want to hold on to a lot of cash, especially long term. Well, what do you do with your cash instead? You can purchase a low-risk, interest-bearing asset. The United States Treasury offers inflation-protected securities. So you could buy a government bond where the interest rate on that bond changes according to the interest rate. Therefore, there's no inflation risk when buying it. Next, you can purchase a low-risk mutual fund. Instead of buying individual stocks or individual corporate bonds, you buy a whole basket of them, which helps increase diversity, lowering risk. Most banks also offer certificates of deposit. There is zero risk here. You're simply not allowed to withdraw for 6 months to 12 months, but usually are offered a much higher interest rate than a traditional savings account. And people buy other assets as well, such as real estate. However, keep in mind that the higher return on an asset usually accompanies a higher level of risk. Treasury securities, certificates of deposits, and very low-risk mutual funds generally carry very little risk. So that's what you can do on the individual level. What can the government do to prevent inflation? Number one is fiscal policy. Governments could slow down the economy by cutting spending or raising taxes. As you imagine, this one's not very popular. No politician likes to be the one to raise taxes or to cut spending for programs people rely on. And so most often governments rely on monetary policy. This is when the central bank, and in the United States the central bank is the Federal Reserve, raises the interest rate. Higher interest rates make loans and transactions more costly, which in turn lowers the pressure on prices to help decrease inflation.